Good morning, everyone. A child who can read chapter books but can't read a map. Who aces spelling tests but falls apart in geometry? That wasn't me when I was in high school. No. Who wants friends desperately but keeps missing what their face is saying? So, for 50 years, clinicians have had a name for this profile, and it's still not in the official diagnostic manual. Why?
Welcome to Little Minds, Big Questions, the podcast about pediatric neuropsychology for parents, teachers, and teens who want real answers about how kids' brains work. I'm Dr. Judy Ho.
And I'm Dr. Grace Mucci. And today we're talking about nonverbal learning disorder, what the science actually shows, what it looks like in a real classroom, and a real home, a real life, and what you can do if you think you're seeing it in a child that you love.
Okay, before we even define it, here's a number that stopped me when I read it. Research estimates that 3 to 4% of North American children may meet criteria for this condition. That's as common as many learning disorders that are household names, but most people have never heard of it. So, nonverbal learning disorder, the name alone is a little confusing. So, what is it actually?
Right. The name throws people off because you hear the word nonverbal and you think, oh, it's a child who doesn't talk. But it's almost always the opposite. These are kids with very strong verbal skills. They have a great vocabulary, they're great readers, they're articulate. The deficit is a processing in the visual and spatial information. So reading a map, understanding a diagram, catching a ball, interpreting someone's facial expressions, that's where things break down.
So, a kid could be reading chapter books at home and completely lost when the teacher puts a graph on the board.
Exactly. And that gap with the strong verbal and weak visual spatial processing, it is a signature of this profile. It is not a language problem, it's a visual spatial processing problem. So, here's why I keep coming back to clinicians have recognized this for over 50 years, but it's still not in the DSM, the official diagnostic manual. Why?
Well, that's the part that's a little confusing and maybe even frustrating, especially for families. The short answer is that the research has been inconsistent to a degree, and that's why the DSM committee hasn't included it yet.
Mhm.
But that's changing because there's now more of a research consensus. There's even a work group that has drafted formal criteria. And researchers are proposing a new name, which I actually think would be better and less confusing. And that is called
Mm,
developmental visual spatial disorder. Again, as we mentioned, the whole nonverbal, that whole piece of it makes people think something different. But when
mhm,
we're talking about it as a developmental visual spatial disorder, that makes it so much clearer in terms of where they might
mhm.
be struggling and also names that it is developmental. So that is hopefully going to be clearer for people who want to make a case for it to be included in the DSM.
That's awesome. So, but in the meantime, clinicians can still identify this profile. It's just diagnosed as a pattern rather than a named checkbox.
Right. And it's a real thing that shows up consistently in neuropsych evaluations. The absence from the DSM doesn't mean that it's not actually something people see. It's a real phenomenon. It's just not
Mhm,
solidified in the same way as some of the other conditions which have made its way into the DSM.
Okay.
So, Grace, parents are going to ask this immediately because a lot of these kids are already flagged for autism or ADHD. There is some overlap. So, how do we
Mhm.
tell the difference between these conditions?
Well, sometimes it can be very difficult, but they can co occur. So a child can have a nonverbal learning disorder and ADHD, for example, but the core deficit is different. So in ADHD, the primary issues is attention regulation, behavioral dysregulation, difficulties in that area. And in autism, it's a communication uh, deficit or difficulties with social communication. With nonverbal learning disorder, the root is in visual spatial processing. And that actually explains the social struggles where it gets really interesting. And it can also affect math, processing, writing, and some of the more subtle social, emotional communication issues.
Yeah. So say more about that. Tell me a little bit more about this piece.
Okay. So kids with nonverbal learning disorder, they do want to connect socially. Their social motivation is typically intact, but they misread facial expressions and the body language because those are visual spatial cues. So it's not that they don't care, it's that the processing system that decodes this social cues isn't working the way it should. And so they tend to maybe talk too much or not be able to respond appropriately. And peers are like looking at them going, what's going on?
Mm.
So
Yeah, that distinction really matters, Grace, in terms of how people can support a child because the intervention looks completely different depending on what the root cause is.
now, and here is something that really landed for me. There was a 2025 study that was published in JAMA Network Open, and this study looked at 180 children with this profile, and they found that there are actually three distinct subtypes. The first subtype is visual spatial deficits plus significant anxiety. Another group had attention problems and reading comprehension layered on top. And then a third group had fluid reasoning difficulties or difficulties with problem solving and math problems. So even within this diagnosis, kids look different from each other. And why, which is why the it doesn't fit neatly argument against DSM inclusion is getting harder to make. The science is getting specific enough to map that variation. Let's bring this into the room where most of our listeners are spending their days. What does a child with NVLD actually look like in school?
They're often the kid who teachers describe as bright but disorganized, great in discussions, articulate, maybe even a strong reader, but struggling with geometry, multi step math, reading charts, or graphs. They might have trouble navigating the hallways, lose track of their assignments, or seem socially awkward in ways that are a little hard to pin down.
Mhm. And because their verbal skills are so strong, adults sometimes assume they're just not trying hard enough or that the math gap is just a confidence problem and they just need more practice.
Yeah, that's, I think, one of the most painful parts for these kids. In the kids and families I've talked to, they know they're smart and they can't understand why there's this huge disconnect. Like, if I'm
Mhm,
smart, why can't I do these things?
mhm,
And that can really do real damage to their self concept and their self esteem over time.
mhm. Absolutely. So this is why that early identification matters so much. And not to label the child, but to explain the experience uh, to them and to the adults that support them.
Okay, Grace. So a parent or teacher is listening to this right now and they're thinking, okay, this sounds like my kid. This sounds like a student that I have. What do they actually do?
Good question. So, first, get a neuropsychological evaluation if you can access one. You're looking for that pattern, that strong verbal scores and verbal processing, significant visual spatial weaknesses. And that profile tells a story even without a formal DSM label.
Definitely, Grace. And on the support side, occupational therapy is often really helpful for those motor and spatial components. So, if the student can receive explicit instruction in visual spatial tasks, rather than assuming a child will pick them up somehow on their own through exposure or just general class. For the social piece, targeted social skills support that is specifically focused on reading nonverbal cues and not just, again, generic basic level social skills groups.
Hmm. Absolutely. And accommodations matter too. So, extended time on visual tasks, graph paper for math to help them line up the numbers so that they don't get mixed up, because that is a very common issue. And preferential seating, organizational supports. These aren't workarounds. They're actually increasing their access to the curriculum.
Absolutely. And for teens specifically, just having a name for what's happening can be so relieving because they have so much more understanding of what's going on and they can put words to a lot of their struggles, but they still can't really fix it. And so a lot of these kids, they've spent years wondering why some things are hard for them when they know that they're capable. So
Mhm,
again, understanding the why changes their internal narrative and can help them to have more helpful conversations with the parents and the teachers that support them.
mhm. Absolutely. So my takeaway for today, for parents specifically, if your child has strong language skills, but really struggles with maps, following directions, geometry, catching the ball, or reading the room socially, that pattern is worth bringing up with the neuropsychologist. Don't wait for a formal label to start asking questions.
And for educators and paraprofessionals, this is a student who looks like they're not trying when they're actually working harder than anyone in the room. The verbal strength can really mask their struggles. So if you see that kind of gap, a bright verbal student, but they're kind of falling apart on anything that requires visual or spatial skills, then
Mhm.
please flag it and advocate for an evaluation.
Absolutely. So this week's downloadable resources in the show notes, a one-page parent guide to nonverbal learning disorder that you can bring to a school meeting or share with your child's teacher.
Awesome. So definitely take advantage of that resource. And if this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. If you have a question for us that you want us to dig into, send it our way on our socials, and that's in the show notes too. Until next time.
Every mind deserves to be understood.